So here we are, day 32 of this escalating conflict in the Middle East, and things have taken a massive turn. We're not just talking about military strategy anymore. Nope, this has spiraled into something much, much bigger, a crisis that's threatening the very foundations of the global economy.
And hey, don't just take my word for it. The head of the World Trade Organization is calling this the worst disruption in 80 years. So what's really going on? This isn't just some regional war anymore. Analysts are warning it's a systemic shock. And today, we're going to connect the dots for you, showing you exactly how this disruption cascades from fuel supplies directly to the food on all of our tables. Okay, so the first thing you really need to understand is that this has evolved into a brutal, grinding war of attrition. A strategy where you just aim to win by wearing down the enemy's resources and their will to fight. And what's fascinating is that it's being defined by two completely clashing strategies.
And this right here is where it gets really interesting. You're looking at a classic case of asymmetry. On one side, Iran and its allies are basically trying to overwhelm defenses, throwing a huge volume of lower-cost missiles and drones at their targets. The thinking is simple, right? Hey, even if you shoot down 90% of them, some are going to get through. But on the other side, you've got the US and Israel relying on these incredibly expensive high-tech interceptors. And their job is to be perfect. They have to shoot down everything, every single time.
So you can probably see the core problem here, can't you? You simply cannot shoot down a seemingly infinite number of missiles with a finite number of defenses. It's a numbers game you're destined to lose. And now, military analysts are reporting that those stockpiles of high-tech interceptors are running critically low. So what do you do then? Well, this fundamental imbalance has forced a massive change in tactics. When you realize you can't win a defensive war, you attack the enemy's ability to even wage it.
And that brings us to the first domino to fall. The whole focus of the conflict has pivoted. It's now moved to direct attacks on the economic heart of the region, its energy, and its industrial infrastructure.
And when we say damage, we are not talking about something that gets fixed in a few weeks. This is being called semi-permanent damage. I mean, just look at this list. We're talking about Qatari gas fields that could take 3 to 5 years to rebuild. Bahrain's largest oil refinery, reportedly completely destroyed. We're even seeing desalination plants get hit. That's 35% of Kuwait's fresh water, gone. Even critical military assets like surveillance planes and tankers are being taken out. This isn't a temporary setback. This is about systematically erasing industrial capacity.
As Jeffrey Sachs puts it so well here, this isn't about the opening or shutting of a strait for a few days. We're talking about the physical destruction of the energy infrastructure itself. And that kind of damage, well, it's irreversible for months and in some cases, years to come. This shows you exactly how a regional conflict becomes a global problem. You're not just blocking the flow, you're destroying the pump.
All right, so that's the production side of things. Now let's move to the second domino and see how all of this builds into a full-blown global energy crisis. What we're seeing is a squeeze on the world's most critical energy arteries, happening at the same time. You've got the Strait of Hormuz, vital for Gulf oil and gas, now blockaded. And then, with Yemen entering the conflict, the Bab al-Mandeb Strait, which is a key passage for 15% of all global trade, is also threatened. I mean, these are the jugular veins of the world economy, and right now, both are being choked off. There's simply no slack left in the system.
And this isn't some far-off problem for next year. According to analysts at JP Morgan, we are days, not months, away from severe shortages hitting every major economic zone. The tankers that were already at sea are arriving now. But once that buffer is gone, the real shortages begin. Look at this timeline. Asia feels it first, then Europe, North America, Australia, all within just a few weeks. This is the immediate consequence.
But believe it or not, the energy shock, that's just the opening act. The real crisis, the one that follows right on its heels, is far more fundamental to our survival. This is about the hidden link between fuel and food.
Now, this is a connection that a lot of people just don't realize, but it is absolutely crucial. Our entire global food supply, the system that feeds 8 billion people, is directly dependent on the availability of natural gas. Why? Because you need immense amounts of it to create the nitrogen fertilizer that allows farmers to grow enough food for everybody. Without it, modern high-yield agriculture simply stops. So you can see the chain reaction here, can't you? It's terrifyingly simple, and it is unavoidable. No gas means no fertilizer. No fertilizer means drastically less food for 8 billion people. This isn't speculation, it's just basic chemistry and logistics. The longer the gas supply is disrupted, the more certain a global food crisis becomes.
So when you have a crisis that hits both energy and food simultaneously, the long-term implications are just
Profound. We could be looking at an acceleration of a complete reset of the entire global order as we know it.
So what should you take away from this? Well, analysts see these trends as the defining features of the world that emerges from this crisis. The end of globalization as we knew it, as nations pivot from global efficiency to national resilience. The decline of the petrodollar system, which was built on the stability of this very region. A mad scramble for sovereignty, as nations race to secure their own food and energy. And of course, the threat that this shock could tip the world from recession into a full-blown depression. The dream of a seamlessly connected global economy has been shattered, and it's being replaced by a much harder-edged focus on national security and self-sufficiency.
So it really leaves us all with this question, right? With these global supply chains that we all depend on shattering before our eyes, how resilient is your world? It's a question that's moving from the hypothetical to the urgent, as the dominoes of this distant conflict begin to fall closer and closer to home.
Usually when we talk about a global crisis, there's this expectation of visibility.
Right, like you can physically see the problem.
Exactly. Like if a Category 5 hurricane is bearing down on the coast, you look at the satellite imagery.
Yeah.
The meteorologist points to this big swirling mass of clouds on the screen and says, hey, there it is. There's the threat.
And then you can act on it. You board up the windows, you buy some bottled water, or, you evacuate.
Right, because the disaster is clean, it's geographically contained, and most importantly, it's something your brain can just easily process.
Well, we definitely find comfort in disasters that actually respect borders and timelines, A localized threat is just something human psychology is well equipped to handle.
But when you step into the world of global energy supply chains and like maritime choke points and modern geopolitics, that comforting satellite map just becomes completely useless.
It really does.
We are currently looking at a crisis landscape that is entirely invisible to the naked eye, but its shockwaves are about to hit every single household on the planet.
Yeah, without a doubt.
So it is the morning of Tuesday, March 31st, 2026. Yeah.
Oh.
This marks the 32nd day since Iran was attacked by Israel and the United States.
Hard to believe it's been over a month already.
I know. And I want to personally welcome you to this deep dive. If you're listening to this right now, you are probably someone who naturally wants to stay ahead of the curve. You like to understand how the gears of the world actually turn.
Right.
And frankly, if you've been opening your news feed or watching YouTube analysis over the past couple of days, you're probably feeling completely overwhelmed.
Oh, absolutely overwhelmed.
Just the sheer volume of conflicting headlines regarding the Middle East right now is insane.
It's an absolute information fire hose out there, and a lot of the water is intentionally muddy. I mean, you have state media broadcasting one narrative and then financial markets reacting to another.
Yeah.
And then military movements just contradicting both of them simultaneously.
Which is exactly why our mission today is to cut through that noise.
Yeah.
The title and the core objective of today's deep dive is this: why the destruction of Gulf energy infrastructure is semi-permanent, and why the Gulf conflict is the precursor to global food insecurity.
It's a heavy topic.
It is. And to get to the bottom of this, we've spent the last couple of days synthesizing dozens of hours of the absolute latest journalist reports, independent geopolitical analysis, and interviews with both military and macroeconomic experts.
Right, so we are strictly looking at the most current data, the physical realities on the ground, and the forecasts being modeled by the people who study these systems for a living.
Yeah, people who actually know what they're talking about.
Exactly, and it is a heavy premise, but it is precisely what the aggregate data is pointing toward. And we should probably establish right up front that the analysis we've pulled together spans a very wide ideological spectrum.
Right.
We're looking at data from conservative defense think tanks, progressive geopolitical analysts, regional Middle Eastern commentators, and, international financial institutions.
Which actually brings me to a crucial point before we really dive into the mechanics of this crisis. I want to explicitly state to you, the listener, that our objective today is strictly to impartially report and analyze the ideas, the facts, and the forecasts contained within these diverse sources.
Yeah.
We are not here to take sides in this conflict. We are not endorsing any specific political viewpoint, left, right, or center.
Right.
Our job is simply to act as your guides through the material.
Yeah.
Just conveying the physical reality of what is happening and what the experts are projecting will happen next.
Because in a landscape dominated by emotional rhetoric, we really need to focus entirely on logistics, supply chains, and military capability.
Okay, so let's start with the big aha moment we're going to unpack today.
Yeah.
The world is currently bracing for an energy shock. We can all feel that.
Oh, definitely.
But the underlying data reveals that the real hidden catastrophe is how this energy war is quietly triggering a global food collapse.
Yeah, the gas pump is really just the beginning. The grocery store is the final destination here.
Right. But to understand how those dominoes are going to fall, we have to start by looking at the severe disconnect between the political rhetoric being broadcast out of Washington and the actual military movements happening on the ground in the Persian Gulf.
Yeah, the divergence between what is being said at press conferences and what is physically being loaded onto cargo ships right now is staggering.
So let's look at the rhetoric first. Over the past few days, the U.S. president has been claiming to be in, quote, serious discussions with what was labeled a new and more reasonable regime in Iran.
Right.
There are statements circulating that a diplomatic deal could be reached very quickly to de-escalate the situation.
Yeah, there was even a public April 6th deadline issued to Iran to accept a 15-point U.S. proposal.
Exactly. And if you just read those headlines, you might think, okay, diplomacy's working, things are cooling down.
But when you cross-reference that with statements coming directly from the Iranian Foreign Ministry, the narrative completely fractures.
Right.
Because Iran has publicly and categorically rejected this 15-point proposal, they have stated unequivocally that there are no direct negotiations happening with the United States.
None at all.
None. Their standing demand is a full, immediate ceasefire, not an unconditional surrender wrapped up in a diplomatic bow.
Right.
And historically, 15-point plans issued with strict ultimatums are rarely designed to actually be accepted. They're often designed to be rejected so that the issuing party can justify the next escalation.
Which perfectly masks the military reality.
Exactly.
Because while the diplomatic smokescreen is projecting imminent peace to, calm the financial markets, the physical buildup of forces is historic.
Yeah.
The latest tracking of military deployments confirms that over 50,000 U.S. military personnel are now stationed in the Middle East.
Right, and that number isn't static. It is actively growing by the day.
Yeah, we just tracked the arrival of the USS Tripoli into the theater.
The Tripoli is a massive amphibious assault ship, and it literally just brought 3,500 sailors and Marines right to the edge of the conflict zone.
And look, you don't deploy an amphibious assault ship packed with Marines to just sit around while diplomats sign a peace treaty.
No, you deploy an amphibious assault ship because you are preparing to put boots on a hostile beach.
Right.
And alongside those Marines, we are seeing forward elements of the 82nd Airborne Division arriving.
Wow.
The Pentagon, according to multiple leaked internal assessments and the consensus of military analysts, is actively preparing for a ground invasion that could last anywhere from weeks to months.
Okay, but I'm trying to wrap my head around what they would actually be invading. I mean, the landmass of Iran is enormous, and it's surrounded by incredibly difficult mountainous terrain.
It is a logistical nightmare, yeah.
But the analysts are pointing to two very specific, highly strategic targets. The first is Karg Island.
Right.
This is Iran's crucial oil export hub, located right in the Persian Gulf. And the alternative target seems to be seizing a series of small, fortified islands in the Strait of Hormuz to wrestle control of the maritime choke points away from the Iranian military.
Right, and seizing Karg Island would be an attempt to apply a massive financial chokehold.
Yeah.
It would theoretically cripple Iran's ability to export whatever oil it has managed to keep flowing, basically cutting off their primary source of foreign currency.
But there is a second reported objective for a ground incursion that I really struggle to process.
Okay.
There are reports circulating that specialized strike forces might be sent deep into Iranian territory to secure roughly 1,000 pounds, which is about 400 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium.
Which, just to put that into context, is highly significant material.
Right.
While it isn't the 90% required for a weapon, 60% enrichment means the vast majority of the difficult centrifugal work has already been completed.
Yep.
It is a hair's breadth away from weapons grade.
I understand the danger of the material, but let me push back on the reality of actually executing this. Going after 1,000 pounds of enriched uranium deep inside Iran sounds like the plot of a bad 1980s action movie. Yep. It's like a Hollywood screenwriter thought, yeah, we'll just parachute some guys in, shoot our way into a secret underground bunker, grab half a ton of highly radioactive material, put in some backpacks, and fly out.
It does sound a bit absurd when you say it like that.
It feels like a complete dismissal of the gritty, terrifying reality of logistics. If our intelligence suggests this uranium is heavily fortified, probably scattered across multiple deep underground sites buried under mountains. And Iran has had literally decades to prepare an asymmetric defense. Isn't telegraphing a massive ground invasion like telling a grandmaster your next 5 chess moves?
The Nicolas Cage analogy is incredibly apt here because Hollywood logistics absolutely do not apply to the Zagros Mountains.
Right.
And you are touching on the exact reason why military scholars are so deeply alarmed by these plans.
Yeah.
Iran has been actively preparing for this specific American invasion scenario since the end of the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s. They don't fight a conventional war. They utilize what military strategists refer to as a mosaic strategy.
A mosaic strategy. I've actually seen that term pop up in a few of the defense papers this week. How does a mosaic strategy actually function when the bombs start falling?
So think of a traditional Western military structure like a pyramid.
Okay.
The command and control flows from the top down. The generals at the Pentagon talk to the theater commanders, who then talk to the field officers.
Right, a standard chain of command.
Exactly. And if you can disrupt the communications at the top, if you can cut off the head of the pyramid, the body is essentially paralyzed. The units on the ground don't know what their broader objective is without that central coordination, but the mosaic strategy assumes from day one that the top of the pyramid is going to be vaporized.
Wait, they just assume their communications will be jammed or destroyed immediately?
Precisely. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, has intentionally structured itself as a highly decentralized network of semi-autonomous cells.
Wow.
It's a literal mosaic of independent combat units. So if Tehran goes dark, if the central command bunkers are completely destroyed by bunker buster munitions, it doesn't matter to the local commander holding a mountain pass or a coastal battery.
Because they already know what to do.
Right. They already have their standing orders. They have their own hidden supply caches, their own localized missile stockpiles, and the absolute authority to wage a protracted asymmetric guerrilla war completely independently.
That is terrifying.
You cannot effectively decapitate a mosaic because every single tile is a self-contained threat.
Which makes sending a centralized conventional force like the 82nd Airborne into that environment incredibly perilous.
Exactly.
And the Iranian leadership has not been subtle about this. They have explicitly threatened to deploy up to 1 million troops to confront any ground incursion.
Yeah, 1 million.
And the rhetoric they used was graphic, warning that they would, quote, set invading troops on fire.
Which is chilling.
It is. And the data proves this isn't just empty bluster. Because despite a month of intense, coordinated U.S. and Israeli airstrikes aimed at degrading their capabilities, the Iranian military machine hasn't ground to a halt.
No, it hasn't.
In fact, one of the most terrifying statistics to emerge this week is that Iranian missile fire has actually increased since week 1 of the conflict.
That data point right there is the ultimate proof of concept for the mosaic strategy.
Yeah.
They absorbed the initial shock and awe campaign. The U.S. dropped precision munitions on their known radar sites and communication hubs, but because the decentralized units were already dug into the mountains with their own localized arsenals, they are now firing back at an accelerating rate.
Wow.
The friction of the war is actually increasing their tempo.
So, because putting boots on the ground presents such catastrophic, politically unacceptable risks, the conflict has primarily remained an escalating air and drone campaign.
Right.
But that inability to land a decisive knockout blow is causing the war to expand horizontally. Since they can't fight a contained ground war, the violence is dangerously spilling over the immediate borders and pulling in completely new actors, which drastically complicates the geometry of the conflict.
Yeah, and the most significant and immediate horizontal escalation is the formal entry of Yemen into the theater.
Right, because we've seen the Houthis launching harassing attacks on shipping for a while, but the geopolitical analysts are making it clear that this has moved far beyond isolated skirmishes or token gestures of solidarity.
Yeah, Yemen is officially in the fray.
They are. They've issued a highly specific threat to completely close the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, which is the vital maritime choke point at the southern entrance to the Red Sea.
Right.
And they're backing up these maritime threats with long-range ballistic actions. We are now seeing confirmed reports of Houthi missile strikes landing deep in southern Israel.
Yeah.
They aren't just firing blindly. They are specifically targeting highly sensitive areas near the Dimona nuclear facility and the Negev desert.
And Dimona is the absolute crown jewel of Israeli national security infrastructure.
Yeah.
By targeting that specific region, the Houthis are forcing Israel to drastically reallocate its air defense assets. Israel is now forced to fight a high-intensity, multi-front war.
A nightmare scenario.
It is. They have to maintain a defensive posture against Iran to the east. They are engaged in brutal combat with Hezbollah in Lebanon to the north. And now they have to intercept ballistic threats coming from Yemen hundreds of miles to the south.
The strain on the Israeli military apparatus is immense.
Right.
Reviewed reports quoting the IDF chief of staff issuing stark warnings that their military is teetering on the verge of collapse.
Right.
They've been running high-intensity combat operations continuously for months.
Yeah.
Their interceptor stockpiles for the Iron Dome and David's sling systems are severely depleted, and they are facing a terrifying technological leap on the northern front with Hezbollah.
Oh, the technological shift happening on the Lebanese border is fundamentally altering modern armored warfare. Yes. Hezbollah is no longer relying solely on unguided Katyusha rockets or older anti-tank weapons. They are aggressively utilizing fiber-optic guided missiles alongside advanced loitering munitions, and the results have been devastating for Israeli armor.
Okay, I understand the basic concept of a laser-guided missile. You point a laser at a tank and the missile rides the beam to the target.
Right.
But I'm having a hard time visualizing how a physical spool of wire is suddenly outsmarting millions of dollars of advanced military sensors. Walk me through the mechanics of why these fiber optic weapons are so lethal.
Oh, it is a brilliant, albeit deadly piece of tactical engineering that actually exploits the very systems designed to protect the tanks.
Okay.
So, modern Israeli battle tanks, like the Merkava IV, are equipped with incredibly advanced active protection systems, most notably the trophy system.
Right, I've heard of that.
Yeah, and these systems rely on a network of high-fidelity radar and laser warning receivers. When a traditional laser-guided missile paints the tank, or when radar detects an incoming projectile, the computer instantly calculates the trajectory and fires a localized shotgun blast of explosive penetrators to destroy the missile midair milliseconds before it hits the armor.
Wow, so the tank essentially swats the missile out of the sky before it
Yeah.
makes physical contact.
Yes, but that entire defensive umbrella relies on detecting an electronic signal, either a laser beam or a radar signature.
Ah.
A fiber-optic guided missile changes the paradigm entirely. The missile physically spools out a hair-thin fiber-optic cable from its tail as it flies through the air.
Wait, literally unspooling wire in midair.
Literally unspooling a wire, the operator is sitting miles away, hidden behind a ridge, looking through a high-definition camera mounted on the nose of the missile.
Wow.
They are steering it with a joystick all the way to the impact point, transmitting the video feed and the steering commands right through that physical wire.
So the missile isn't emitting a laser, and it's flying low enough to avoid radar tracking.
Exactly. It's completely silent on the electromagnetic spectrum. There is no radio frequency to jam, no laser to trigger the warning receivers.
That's crazy.
The Israeli tank sensors detect absolutely nothing until the physical impact occurs. The reactive armor doesn't have time to deploy its countermeasures because the threat warning systems are completely bypassed. It is a true stealth kill for mechanized armor.
And the attrition rates reported by the military observers are staggering. There were reports of 21 main battle tanks lost in a single day of fighting.
Yeah, 21.
Losing 21 heavy tanks in 24 hours is a catastrophic, unsustainable attrition rate for any modern mechanized force.
Absolutely.
It is incredible how a simple spool of wire, leveraging high-speed data transfer, defeats the most sophisticated sensor suites on Earth.
It really is. But you know, the technological and geographic spillover of this conflict isn't just contained to the Middle East.
No.
The interconnectedness of modern drone warfare and global energy markets is actually creating a bizarre direct merger between the war in the Gulf and the war in Ukraine.
Okay, let's unpack this because the geopolitical irony here is almost unbelievable.
It really is.
We are looking at verified reports of Ukrainian drones flying directly over sovereign NATO airspace. These drones are traversing over Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, crossing the Baltic Sea to strike highly strategic Russian oil export terminals at Ust-Luga and Primorsk.
And flying armed drones over the airspace of 3 NATO member states is an absolutely massive provocation and a colossal strategic risk.
Yeah.
I mean, if one of those Ukrainian drones were to experience a malfunction and crash in an Estonian suburb, or if Russian air defenses intercepted it over Lithuanian territory, it could theoretically trigger a NATO Article 5 consultation.
But look at the strategic paradox this creates for the global superpowers.
Yeah.
Listeners, think about how twisted these global alliances have become in the span of just a month.
Yeah.
Russia is actively manufacturing and sending advanced drone technology to Iran.
Right.
At the exact same time, Ukraine, who is fighting Russia, is actively supplying advanced anti-drone intelligence and electronic warfare tactics to Israel and the Gulf states to help them fight off those Russian-designed drones being used by Iran and its proxies.
It is a massive proxy web.
Yeah.
And while that intelligence sharing and cross-border bombing is happening, the United States finds itself in an incredibly compromised economic position.
Right.
The U.S. administration is quietly relaxing heavy sanctions to allow Russian oil shipments to flow into Cuba, specifically to ease the immense pressure on global energy prices caused by the Middle East conflict.
The United States is essentially turning a blind eye and quietly begging for Russian oil to hit the open market to stabilize domestic gas prices. While Ukraine, the ally of the U.S., is spending billions to arm, is actively bombing those exact same Russian oil reserves in the Baltic Sea to cut off Putin's war funding.
It's insane.
We are watching a localized conflict in the Persian Gulf force global superpowers into utterly contradictory schizophrenic alliances.
It perfectly illustrates the reality of modern geopolitics. When push comes to shove, macroeconomic survival almost always trumps stated political ideologies.
Wow.
And that economic survival brings us to the most critical shift in this entire conflict. We are no longer just looking at a war of military attrition.
No.
We are witnessing the targeted, physical, semi-permanent eradication of the energy infrastructure that powers the modern world.
Because neither side can establish military dominance on the ground or in the air, the tactics have shifted to economic total war.
Right.
And we really need to draw a sharp line between what is happening today and the historical comparisons people are trying to make. I keep seeing commentators comparing this to the infamous 1970s oil crisis.
Yeah, it's a very common comparison, but it's fundamentally flawed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
In 1973, the Arab states imposed a political oil embargo. But the oil was still in the ground, the refineries were completely fine, the pipelines were intact. They simply turned off the tap as a political negotiating tactic.
Yeah, the 1973 embargo was a political decision that was eventually reversed with a political agreement.
Yeah.
The infrastructure was waiting to be turned back on.
Right.
What we are seeing in the Gulf today is entirely different. The fundamental capacity to extract, refine, and ship that energy is being physically blown to pieces by high explosive munitions. You cannot reverse a cruise missile strike with a peace treaty.
Let's look at the sheer scale of the destruction based on the damage assessments coming out this week. It is staggering.
Yeah.
We saw a catastrophic direct strike on Bahrain's Gapco refinery. This isn't just a minor facility. This is the largest, oldest refinery in the Middle East.
Right.
It has a processing capacity of up to 400,000 barrels of crude oil per day, refining it into diesel, jet fuel, and gasoline for the global market. That facility has been devastated.
And the hits on refined oil products are really only half the story. You have to look at Qatar. Qatar is arguably the world's most important exporter of liquefied natural gas, or LNG. European and Asian economies are deeply reliant on Qatari gas to keep their power grids running.
Right.
The intelligence reports indicate that one of Qatar's 2 primary LNG liquefaction facilities suffered a massive strike. In a single afternoon, 50% of their total national export capacity was instantly wiped off the map.
And it is absolutely critical to note that the U.S. military presence in the region has been unable to shield this infrastructure.
Not at all.
Iran has clearly proven they can pierce the absolute best multi-layered air and missile defenses the Gulf states and the U.S. military have to offer.
Yeah.
They didn't just hit refineries, they successfully targeted and destroyed an American E-3 Sentry, a highly advanced AWACS radar warning plane, along with multiple heavy refueling tankers parked at the Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia.
Which is huge. Destroying an AWACS plane on the tarmac is a massive capability kill.
Yeah.
It temporarily blinds the U.S. military's aerial coordination, and by destroying the tankers, severely limits the loiter time and range of American fighter jets trying to patrol the region.
Wow.
But returning to the civilian energy infrastructure, what's fascinating here is that the most alarming part of these damage assessments isn't just what was destroyed, it's the brutal engineering reality of what it takes to rebuild it.
Right. This is where that term semi-permanent comes into play.
Exactly.
Because if a factory burns down in the U.S., you assume they clear the rubble and rebuild it in a year. You can't just call up a contractor and order a new LNG liquefaction facility.
Not even close. You cannot buy the components for an LNG facility or a specialized ultra-deepwater wellhead off the shelf.
Right.
These are not mass-produced interchangeable parts. They require incredibly bespoke custom fabrication, We are talking about massive 80-meter-long pressure vessels designed to supercool natural gas to minus 260 degrees Fahrenheit.
The metallurgy alone to handle those temperatures without shattering is incredibly specialized.
The metallurgy, the custom pipe fitting, the highly intricate safety and blow-off valve systems. There are only a handful of specialized engineering firms in the world, mostly in Europe and Asia, capable of manufacturing these components.
Wow.
They are hand-manufactured, and there is already a years-long backlog for these parts in peacetime.
So, based on the engineering forecasts we reviewed, what is the realistic timeline to replace the Qatari LNG capacity or the Bapco refinery that was destroyed yesterday?
Assuming the war ended tomorrow, and assuming you have a perfectly peaceful environment to bring thousands of foreign engineers and heavy cranes into the region, which they obviously do not, replacing these facilities will take 3 to 5 years, minimum.
35 years.
Yeah. The destruction we are witnessing will remove millions of barrels of refining capacity and billions of cubic feet of gas from the global market for half a decade.
3 to 5 years of structurally reduced global energy supply. And that grim timeline assumes that the oil and gas facilities that miraculously haven't been bombed can actually get their product out of the region. Which brings us to the geographic chokeholds.
Right. In the global energy trade, geography is destiny. You can pump all the oil you want, but if you can't float it on a tanker to the buyer, it is worthless.
So let's remind everyone of the map. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow ribbon of water between Iran and Oman. Roughly 20% of the entire globe's oil consumption passes through that strait.
Right.
And it is currently de facto controlled and blockaded by the Iranian military.
And simultaneously, if the Houthis in Yemen maintain their blockade of the Bay of El-Mandeb Strait at the southern end of the Red Sea, that traps another 10 to 15% of the world's seaborne oil and refined products.
Which forces the global shipping industry into a complete logistical nightmare.
Oh, yeah.
Because to avoid the drones and anti-ship missiles in the Red Sea, massive supertankers and container ships have to completely reroute all the way down the coast of Africa, around the Cape of Good Hope, and back up the Atlantic.
Right. And rerouting around the Horn of Africa adds a minimum of 8 to 10 extra days of travel time each way.
Wow.
A vessel burns thousands of tons of extra bunker fuel just to make the journey. Because each trip takes longer, you suddenly need 20% more ships on the water just to maintain the same delivery schedule, causing a massive shortage of available hulls.
That's crazy.
And on top of that, maritime insurance underwriters like Lloyd's of London are skyrocketing their war risk premiums for any vessel even tangentially associated with the region.
Okay, I see all this macro-level data, but I want to ground this in the reality of the listener.
Yeah.
If I'm listening to this deep dive while driving to work right now, I am already feeling the squeeze. I'm seeing gas approach $9 a gallon in places like Los Angeles.
Yeah.
Brent crude oil is blowing past $115 a barrel on the commodities market. I feel that financial pain immediately when I fill up my tank.
Yeah.
But looking at the forecasts, the cost of my commute is actually the least of my worries, isn't it?
The pain at the gas pump is highly visible, but it is ultimately superficial compared to the deeper systemic shock.
Right.
Yes, the high price of crude oil drives up the cost of manufacturing plastics, it drives up the cost of transporting consumer goods, and it fuels baseline inflation. But the true existential crisis is hidden in the disruption of the natural gas supply.
And this perfectly bridges the gap to the most terrifying revelation in all the data we reviewed. The energy crisis, the $9 gas, the rerouted ships. That is actually just the ignition switch for a much larger bomb. We are looking at the immediate precursor to global food insecurity.
It all comes down to an invisible, universally misunderstood ingredient, natural gas.
Right, and I think most people, myself included, think of natural gas strictly as an energy source.
Sure.
It's the blue flame on my stove, it's what heats my house in the winter, maybe it powers the local electrical grid. How does a destroyed LNG gas facility in Qatar directly translate to empty grocery store shelves in Europe, Asia, or the United States?
Okay, let's explain the why here. It connects through one of the most important yet least discussed scientific breakthroughs in human history, the Haber-Bosch process.
The Haber-Bosch process.
Yeah. In the agricultural world, natural gas is not used for its energy. It is used as a foundational chemical building block. The air we breathe is mostly nitrogen, but plants cannot absorb nitrogen directly from the air to grow. They need it in the soil.
They need fertilizer.
Exactly. Through the Haber-Bosch process, chemical plants take natural gas, specifically the methane, and subject it to massive heat and pressure. They physically strip the hydrogen molecules away from the carbon.
Okay.
They then take that pure hydrogen and bond it with nitrogen pulled directly from the atmosphere to synthesize ammonia. Ammonia is the foundational ingredient for almost all commercial synthetic fertilizers used across the globe today.
Wow. So natural gas isn't just the fuel running the fertilizer factory. The physical molecules of the gas are quite literally the building blocks of the fertilizer itself.
Yes.
If you don't have the natural gas, you physically lack the chemistry to create the food supply.
Exactly. And without the Haber-Bosch process and synthetic fertilizers, the Earth could naturally support roughly 4 billion people.
Wow.
We currently have over 8 billion people on the planet.
Yeah.
Half of the global population is entirely dependent on synthetic fertilizer for their baseline caloric survival.
That is wild.
So when you see the destruction of Gulf LNG facilities and you see the blockade of these vital shipping straits, you are violently severing the supply chain at both ends. You are cutting off the export of finished fertilizers produced in the Middle East, and you are cutting off the raw natural gas needed by domestic factories in Europe and Asia to manufacture their own localized fertilizer.
And the timing of this disruption is mathematically devastating.
It could not possibly be worse. We are squarely in the critical global planting season for the Northern Hemisphere. Farmers are sitting at their kitchen tables right now, looking at the skyrocketing commodity prices, making hard decisions about what crops to plant or whether they can afford to plant at all.
Right. Because if the synthetic fertilizer isn't physically available to buy, or if the price is tripled and the farmer simply can't secure the credit to purchase it, they don't apply it to their fields.
Yeah.
The crops still grow, but the yields per acre plummet. And we are already seeing this cascading effect tear through the developing world.
Oh, absolutely.
The agricultural reports highlighted the situation in Sudan, a country where the baseline food security is already incredibly fragile due to internal conflict.
Right.
That fragile system is completely breaking down as we speak. Sudanese farmers cannot afford or physically access the imported fertilizers they need, which Analysts project will lead to an imminent catastrophic collapse in their crop yields for the upcoming harvest.
Sudan is the canary in the coal mine, but the energy and agricultural shock is forcing severe, desperate measures globally.
Yeah.
We are seeing strict rationing of fuel and rolling electricity blackouts in Mauritius and Uganda, but it's not just the developing world. Highly industrialized nations like South Korea are implementing emergency energy conservation measures. We're tracking reports of panic buying breaking out in supermarkets in South Africa as citizens realize the implications of the shipping reroutes.
One of the most chilling validations of this data came from a direct quote we found from the Director General of the World Trade Organization.
Yeah.
The head of the WTO stated on the record that this is the, quote, worst disruption to the world's trading system in 80 years.
80 years.
We have to go back 8 decades, back to the height of the Second World War, to find a comparable systemic shock to global logistics.
And World War II is the only valid comparison because this isn't just a regional conflict or a singular commodity spike. It is a simultaneous systemic shock to energy availability, maritime trade routes, and the foundational chemical inputs for human agriculture.
So, what does this all mean? Let me break down the stark reality of the math for you. We are essentially hanging ourselves on a macroeconomic level. Our modern, highly optimized civilization relies heavily on the uninterrupted flow of Gulf natural gas to synthesize the fertilizer required to feed 8 billion people. Without that gas, global crop yields inevitably drop this season.
Right.
When the yields drop, the global supply of staple crops, wheat, corn, rice, and soy plummets. When supply plummets while demand remains constant, food prices explode.
It's basic economics.
Exactly. This isn't a theoretical warning about climate change or a problem for the next decade. This is a very real mathematical certainty for this summer and autumn's harvest.
The inflationary spike we're going to see at the grocery store checkout line in 6 months will make the post-pandemic inflation look like a minor statistical anomaly.
But while the Western world is bracing for severe inflation and agricultural shortages, the nations that actually host the military bases that sparked this conflict are facing something much darker.
Yeah, they really are.
They're facing an immediate existential threat to their very survival.
To understand the sheer panic gripping the Gulf monarchies right now, we have to look past the oil wells and focus on the singular Achilles heel of the entire region: water.
Right, because nations like the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, these places are famous for their glittering, ultra-modern metropolises.
Yeah.
Dubai looks like a city from the 22nd century, But beneath the glass skyscrapers, they're built in the middle of some of the most unforgiving, arid deserts on the planet.
Exactly.
They have virtually no natural groundwater reserves. They are utterly 100% reliant on massive, incredibly energy-intensive desalination plants along the coast to convert salt water from the Persian Gulf into fresh drinking water.
And these desalination plants, whether they use reverse osmosis or massive thermal evaporation, require immense amounts of uninterrupted electricity to function.
Yeah.
Without those plants running 247, there is no water. The strategic reserves in these cities are measured in days, not months. Days. And the security briefings highlighted a recent devastating missile strike on a primary desalination plant in Kuwait. In a single instant, that one strike knocked offline roughly 35% of the entire country's fresh water supply capacity.
It's almost unfathomable to think about.
It really is.
If you live in a luxury high-rise in Abu Dhabi or Dubai, your continued existence in that climate depends entirely on incredibly fragile, highly exposed coastal infrastructure.
Right.
And the sudden realization of this vulnerability is actively destroying the very foundation of their economies. We are watching the real-time evaporation of the Gulf's oasis business model.
The psychology of that business model is fascinating. For the past 2 decades, places like the UAE meticulously constructed their economies on a highly specific, heavily marketed mirage. The idea that they were an impregnable oasis.
Right.
They marketed themselves as safe, hyper-stable, crime-free hubs for Western tourism, international corporate headquarters, and a playground for the global super-rich.
Basically, come to Dubai, buy a multi-million-dollar condo on a synthetic island, enjoy the luxury malls, and live completely insulated from the historical chaos of the Middle East.
Exactly. But that insulation was entirely reliant on the perception that the American security umbrella was flawless. The moment an Iranian drone slips through the air defenses, the illusion shatters.
And the economic fallout from that shattered illusion has been instantaneous.
Yeah.
The financial data we reviewed cites that Dubai real estate is already seeing massive panic selling, with discounts of 20 to 30% popping up just to liquidate assets.
Wow.
There was a massive wave of capital flight as foreign investors pull their money out of regional banks. And the Western expats, the engineers, bankers, and consultants who actually manage a significant portion of the corporate infrastructure there, were booking seats on the very first commercial flights out of the region the moment the airspace restrictions allowed it.
The expats are fleeing because they understand that the fundamental retaliation equation has changed. They recognize that the Gulf states are caught in an impossible geopolitical vice.
So let's talk about the specific threat that put them in that vice. What is Iran's explicit warning regarding retaliation against the Gulf states?
Well, the Iranian military leadership has drawn a very public, completely unambiguous red line.
Right.
They have stated directly to the Gulf monarchies that any country allowing its sovereign soil, its military bases, or its airspace to be utilized by U.S. or Israeli forces to launch strikes against Iranian territory will be considered an active combatant.
Okay.
And the retaliation will not be directed at the American military bases themselves. The retaliation will level the host nation's civilian and economic infrastructure.
Wow, they bypass the military targets and go straight for the societal jugular.
It is a brutal, yet highly effective strategic calculation. If we connect this to the bigger picture, Iran recognizes they cannot defeat the United States military in a conventional shootout. But they don't need to. They just need to make the collateral cost of hosting the American military far too high for the Gulf monarchs to bear. If a U.S. fighter wing launches a sortie from an airbase in the UAE, and Iran retaliates by destroying the primary thermal desalination plant powering Dubai, that city literally becomes unlivable in 48 hours.
That's horrifying.
Without water and air conditioning in the desert summer, a city of 3 million people faces mass casualties in a matter of days.
It's an extortion tactic.
Wow.
The Gulf monarchs are looking at that equation and realizing that the immense U.S. military presence, which they have paid billions of dollars to host because it was supposed to be their ultimate shield, has actually painted a giant, glowing target on their most vulnerable infrastructure.
Exactly. Their entire national survival now depends on rapidly recalculating decades-old security alliances. They have to decide if the U.S. is an asset or a liability.
Which accelerates us into the final overarching theme of the data we analyzed. Because the localized destruction in the Persian Gulf, combined with the resulting global food and energy shortages, is acting as a catalyst for a massive, structural geopolitical realignment. We are watching the global world order being actively rewritten.
The shift is happening rapidly, and it is being driven primarily by the severe economic backlash beginning to hit the Western world. Politics always follows economics.
Right, so let's look at the financial models for the United States. The probability of a severe U.S. recession is skyrocketing as the energy shock ripples through the supply chain.
Yeah.
Major financial institutions are sounding the alarm in their latest guidance. Moody's Analytics currently places the odds of a U.S. recession at a staggering 49%.
49%.
The Wilmington Trust puts their model at 45%. In macroeconomic forecasting, anything over 20% in a 12-month span is considered a massive red flag.
A 49% probability isn't just a warning, it suggests the foundational mechanisms of a recession are already locked in and moving. And this economic reality is creating immense, paralyzing political strain in Washington, D.C.
The fiscal numbers are jaw-dropping. The U.S. administration is looking at a reported $200 billion price tag just to fund the supplemental munitions and logistics for this current early phase of the Iran conflict.
Yeah.
And they are attempting to secure that massive funding package through Congress while simultaneously dealing with historic national debt refinancing costs and a severe public backlash over exploding inflation at the grocery store.
That perfect storm.
We're seeing political reporting indicating that lawmakers are quietly weighing desperate measures, including proposing cuts to domestic health care and social programs, just to find the capital to foot the bill for the military deployments.
From a purely historical perspective, when a government tells its domestic voters that it must cut their healthcare and social safety nets to fund an overseas war, a war that is simultaneously making their gasoline and groceries unaffordable, that government loses its political mandate incredibly fast.
Right.
The domestic political will to sustain a long-term conflict just collapses.
And while Washington is paralyzed by this domestic economic and political backlash, the rest of the world is not waiting around for American leadership. We are seeing a historic multipolar diplomatic shift happening in real time.
Yeah, the geopolitical analysts were hyper-focused on an extraordinary development happening right now in Islamabad. Pakistan has stepped into the diplomatic vacuum and is actively hosting urgent multilateral peace talks.
Look at who is sitting at that table. You have high-level representatives from Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt, and Pakistan, all trying to broker a regional framework to de-escalate the violence with Iran.
Right.
These are the major Sunni powers negotiating directly. And who is glaringly absent from that table? The United States.
The absence of the U.S. is the defining feature of those talks. For half a century, nothing happened in the Middle East without an American diplomat sitting at the head of the table, brokering the deal. Now, the region is actively attempting to organize its own diplomatic exit ramp because they no longer view the U.S. as the ultimate guarantor of regional security. In fact, many of these capitals increasingly view the U.S. military presence as the primary destabilizing force.
Wow.
They are bypassing Washington entirely to save themselves.
It is a stunning, undeniable loss of American hegemony in a region they have dominated since the Cold War. But beyond the diplomatic maneuvering, here's where it gets really interesting. There is one final, terrifying wild card that could permanently, irreversibly alter the balance of global power. The nuclear wild card.
Yeah, the reports coming out of Tehran over the last 48 hours indicate that the Iranian parliament is currently, publicly and very seriously weighing legislation to formally exit the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT.
If they exit the NPT, they are kicking out the international inspectors and turning off the cameras in their nuclear facilities.
Right.
Think about the historical precedents that the foreign policy experts pointed out this week. The Iranian political and military leadership has watched the last 20 years of U.S. foreign policy with intense scrutiny.
Yeah.
Look at the outcome for Libya. Muammar Gaddafi voluntarily gave up his nascent nuclear weapons program to normalize relations with the West. A few years later, his regime was overthrown, and he was killed during a NATO-backed intervention.
Exactly.
Look at Iraq. Saddam Hussein did not actually possess weapons of mass destruction, and his country was invaded, his military dismantled, and his government destroyed.
And then you contrast those two examples with North Korea.
Exactly, the comparison the analysts are making. North Korea refused to compromise. They kept their nuclear program, they successfully tested and built a functional, deliverable nuclear deterrent. And despite being a global pariah state, heavily sanctioned and isolated, the Kim regime has survived for decades without ever facing a kinetic Western invasion.
The strategic takeaway for the Iranian elite, especially while under active bombardment by U.S. and Israeli forces, is brutally clear.
Yeah.
They increasingly view the acquisition of a nuclear weapon, a functional, undeniable deterrent, as their absolute singular guarantee of national sovereignty against American regime change efforts.
Because conventional deterrence has failed.
Right. The nuclear option is all they have left. If they formally leave the NPT, they are signaling to the world that they are sprinting for the bomb.
And once that threshold is crossed, it triggers a nuclear arms race across the entire Middle East. Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Egypt will all seek their own deterrence. The entire architecture of global security unravels.
That unraveling is the ultimate macro-level consequence of this conflict. What we are witnessing today is the violent acceleration of the end of a unipolar world, a world dictated solely by the economic and military might of the United States. We are seeing regional powers successfully weaponize global maritime straits, proving that cheap drones can hold global trade hostage. We are seeing the wealthy Gulf states realizing they must pivot their alliances toward Asia, specifically toward China and India, for their future economic and physical security, because the American shield is fractured.
Yeah, and we are watching the physical, fiery destruction of the energy infrastructure that physically underpins the petrodollar system. The center of global gravity is violently shifting east right before our eyes.
It is a profound, unsettling, and frankly terrifying transformation of the world we thought we lived in. To briefly recap the massive journey we've just taken you on through the data, what began 32 days ago as a targeted high-tech air campaign has morphed into the physical, multi-year destruction of global energy pipelines and refining capacity.
Right.
That physical destruction of natural gas and shipping lanes is currently planting the seeds for a devastating worldwide food and fertilizer crisis. And the resulting economic shockwaves are fundamentally rewriting the map of Middle Eastern alliances and effectively ending decades of American diplomatic dominance in the region.
It is the geopolitical domino effect operating in its purest, most destructive, and most unpredictable form. And I want to remind you, the listener, as you go about your day-to-day, while you might feel geographically insulated from the politics and the violence of the Persian Gulf, the deeply, inextricably interconnected nature of our modern supply chains means the effects of this war are not staying in the Middle East.
No, they're not.
They are already on the water. They will inevitably show up at your local grocery store, at your gas pump, and in your utility bills over the next few months. That invisible storm we talked about at the beginning of the hour, it is making landfall right now.
I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over, building on the shifting alliances we just discussed. If the Gulf states fully realize that American military bases can no longer protect their oil facilities or their vital desalination plants, and instead those bases only serve to make their cities targets for devastating retaliation, how long before we see those very nations, the historical allies of the West, actively ask the United States military to pack up and leave the Middle East entirely?
A completely reshaped world order, driven by the absolute necessity of water and survival. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the data. We hope this extensive analysis helped clear the muddy waters of your news feed and gave you a framework to understand what is coming next. Keep paying attention, stay curious, keep questioning the headlines, and remember, just because you can't see the gears of the global supply chain doesn't mean they aren't turning. Until next time.